Why is my 8-month pregnant wife kneeling on the floor?
I'm teaching her who this house belongs to.
Good, because tonight, you're losing everything.
The day I found my 8-month pregnant wife on her knees washing my mother's feet, I learned that the cruelest person in my home was not a stranger. It was the woman who had raised me. And before that night was over, I discovered she had not come to visit us. She had come to steal our house, destroy my marriage, and make sure my unborn daughter never inherited a thing. Hello, my name is Daniel Mercer. I am 36 years old, and I live outside Charlotte, North Carolina. For most of my life, I believed I knew the difference between a difficult mother and a dangerous one. I was wrong. My wife, Emily, was 8 months pregnant when everything happened. We had been married for 6 years, and our daughter was due in 5 weeks. We had already painted the nursery a soft green. A wooden sign above the crib read, "Welcome." Lily, Emily had chosen the name. My late father had chosen the house. That detail mattered more than I understood at the time. My father, Henry Mercer, died 3 years earlier. He had been quiet, careful, and far kinder than my mother, Victoria. He spent 40 years building a regional construction company from one pickup truck and a borrowed cement mixer. By the time he retired, Mercer Residential had offices in 3 states. My mother loved telling people she had built the company beside him. The truth was that she loved spending what he built. After Dad died, the company passed to me and my younger sister Claire. The large family home outside Charlotte was placed in a trust. Dad had allowed my mother to live there for life, but she could not sell it. Emily and I lived in a different house, a modern stone home with white columns, tall windows, and pale marble floors. Dad had helped me buy it before our wedding. I paid him back over 5 years, and the deed was in my name, at least, that was what I believed. The week before I found Emily on the floor, I was supposed to be in Atlanta for 4 days. Our company was negotiating a hotel renovation contract, and I was leading the final meetings. My mother offered to stay with Emily while I was gone. She shouldn't be alone this late in the pregnancy, she told me. Emily did not look excited, but she smiled. "It's only 4 days," she said. I should have noticed how tightly she held her coffee cup. I should have asked why she had stopped looking my mother in the eye. Instead, I kissed her forehead, placed my hand over our baby, and promised I would be home Friday night. The meetings ended early. On Thursday afternoon, the hotel's owners signed the contract. I decided not to call Emily because I wanted to surprise her. I bought her favorite lemon cake from a bakery near the airport and drove home through heavy rain. At 6017 that evening, I opened my front door. The house was strangely quiet. My mother's shoes were beside the entry table. Emily's slippers were near the staircase. A silver basin sat in the middle of the living room. Then I heard crying. It was not ordinary crying. It was the broken, breathless sound of someone trying not to scream. I followed it into the formal sitting room. My mother was seated in a cream-colored chair. Her bare feet rested in a bowl of warm water. Emily was kneeling in front of her. My pregnant wife's hands were shaking as she held a wet cloth. Tears ran down her face and dropped onto the marble. One of her knees was red. The other had a dark bruise beneath it. My mother looked down at her with cold satisfaction. "Do it properly," she said. "If you expect to live in a Mercer house, you should learn how to show gratitude." Emily whispered, "Please, I feel dizzy." My mother leaned forward. "This house belongs to my children, not you. You came here with nothing. Do not confuse a wedding ring with ownership." The cake box slipped from my hand and hit the floor. Both women turned. Emily's face changed first. Relief appeared for half a second, then fear covered it. My mother did not look afraid. She looked annoyed. "Daniel," she said, as if I had interrupted dinner. "You're home early." I crossed the room and lifted Emily carefully. Her legs nearly collapsed beneath her. "How long have you been on the floor?" She could not answer. My mother stood and reached for a towel. "Don't be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding." I looked at the bruise on Emily's knee. "Did you push not?" Emily gripped my sleeve. "Daniel, my stomach hurts." Everything else disappeared. I called 911. My mother protested while I helped Emily lie on the sofa. She said an ambulance would embarrass the family. She said the neighbors would watch. She even told Emily to stop crying because stress was bad for the baby. I remember turning toward her and speaking more calmly than I felt. If you say one more word to my wife, you will leave this house with the police. For the first time, my mother went silent. At the hospital, doctors found that Emily was dehydrated and experiencing contractions. Fortunately, our daughter was not in immediate danger, but the doctor wanted Emily kept overnight. When we were finally alone, I asked what had happened. Emily stared at the blanket. It didn't start today. Those 4 words made my blood run cold. She told me my mother had been visiting whenever I was away. Sometimes she arrived without warning. Sometimes she used an old key I did not know she still had. At first, it was criticism. The kitchen was not clean enough. Emily's clothes were too cheap. The nursery looked childish. The baby's name sounded ordinary. Then it became worse. My mother began moving Emily's belongings into boxes. She threw away baby gifts from Emily's family. She told her that after Lily was born, a proper Mercer nanny would take over. 2 months earlier, she had shown Emily a legal document. It claimed that our house belonged to the Mercer family trust. My mother told Emily that she could be removed at any time. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Emily's eyes filled again. I tried. She reminded me of 3 conversations I had dismissed. Once, she had said my mother made her uncomfortable when I traveled. I answered, she is just protective. Another time, she asked if Victoria had a legal interest in our house. I laughed and said, Mom likes to act important. The last time, Emily told me she did not want my mother present during the birth. I accused her of making me choose between my wife and my mother. Now she looked at me with a pain deeper than anything Victoria had caused. Every time I tried to tell you, you explained her behavior instead of listening to me. There was no defense. I had not abused my wife, but I had left the door open for the person who did. I apologized. Emily did not immediately forgive me. She only said, I need to know whether Lily and I are safe. I promised her they would be. Then I left the hospital room and called a locksmith. By midnight, every exterior lock had been replaced. The security codes were changed. My mother's belongings were packed and delivered to a hotel. I also called my father's former attorney, Samuel Reed. Samuel was 71 and almost impossible to surprise. But when I told him what Victoria had said about the trust owning my house, he became quiet. Daniel, come to my office tomorrow, he said. Do not discuss property documents with your mother until we speak. The next morning, I sat across from Samuel while Emily rested at the hospital. He placed 2 deeds on his desk. The first was the deed I knew. It showed that my father had transferred the house to me 6 years earlier. The second had been filed with the county 3 months ago. It appeared to transfer the property from me to the Mercer family trust. My signature was at the bottom before. That is not my signature, I said. Samuel nodded. I didn't believe it was. The document had been notarized by a woman named Patricia Sloan. I recognized the name. Patricia was my mother's oldest friend. Samuel then showed me something worse. The trust had been amended 2 weeks after the false deed was filed. Under the amendment, my mother became the sole acting trustee. Claire and I were listed as beneficiaries, but only after Victoria's death. My wife and unborn child had no protection. If the documents survived a legal challenge, my mother could borrow against our house, attempt to sell it, or use it to secure debts. Why would she do this now? I asked. Samuel opened another folder. My mother had accumulated nearly $2 million in private debt, luxury travel, jewelry, bad investments, loans against artwork that did not belong to her. She had also guaranteed money for a man named Curtis Vale. Curtis called himself a financial consultant. He was really a professional parasite with 2 bankruptcies and a talent for finding wealthy widows. My mother had not humiliated Emily only because she hated her. She was trying to frighten Emily into leaving before the fraud was discovered. Samuel advised me to contact the police immediately. I wanted to, but I also wanted to know how deep it went, so we did both. We reported the forged deed to a detective in the County Financial Crimes Unit. Then, under his guidance, we avoided confronting my mother. The detective asked us to preserve messages, recordings, financial statements, and security footage. That was when I remembered the cameras. We had installed indoor security cameras 2 years earlier after a burglary in our neighborhood. Emily disliked being recorded inside the house, so we turned most of them off, but not all. A camera remained above the rear hallway because it covered the mudroom entrance and the door to my office. I checked the cloud account. The footage from the previous 30 days had been deleted. But my mother had made a mistake. The system kept deleted recordings in an archive for 48 hours. I restored them. At 2013 on Wednesday afternoon, the camera showed my mother entering my office with Curtis Vale. He carried a black leather case. They remained inside for 40 minutes. When they came out, Curtis said, "Once the equity line clears, we move the money before Daniel gets back." My mother answered, "Emily will be gone by then. She is too weak to fight." Curtis laughed. "And your son?" My mother paused at the door. "Daniel has spent his whole life believing that obedience is love. He will forgive me. He always does." That sentence hurt because it was true. She had trained me to call surrender respect. She had taught me that every boundary was an insult and every objection was betrayal. Even after I watched the recording, a small part of me wanted to call her and demand an explanation. Samuel stopped me. "Do not ask a liar for the truth when you already have evidence." The detective traced the planned loan to Piedmont Heritage Bank. My mother had applied for a $1.4 million home equity line using the forged deed. The closing was scheduled for Monday. We had 4 days. On Friday morning, I brought Emily home. She froze when we entered the sitting room. The silver basin was gone, but the memory was not. I asked if she wanted to stay somewhere else. She shook her head. "I want her out of our home. I don't want her to take it from me." That afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was soft and wounded. "Daniel, I understand that emotions were high. I am willing to forgive Emily if she apologizes." I almost laughed. Instead, I played the role she expected. "Mom, Emily looked at me sharply, but I held up one finger. My mother exhaled with satisfaction. "I knew you would see reason." I told her I wanted to repair the family. I suggested a Sunday dinner at our house with Claire, Samuel, and Patricia Sloan. My mother hesitated. "Why invite the notary?" I pretended to be confused. "Notary." She recovered quickly. "I meant Patricia. She used to be a notary." That lie gave the detective another thread. Patricia's notary commission had expired 8 months before she stamped the deed. On Saturday, Patricia called me privately. She was crying. She admitted that my mother had asked her to notarize a document Daniel had already signed. Patricia never saw me sign it. She stamped it because Victoria promised the paperwork was only for estate planning. Then Curtis paid her $10,000. Patricia had spent most of it. She agreed to cooperate with investigators. By Sunday morning, we had enough evidence to stop the loan. But I wanted more than a canceled transaction. I wanted my mother to admit what she had done to Emily. The detective approved a controlled confrontation as long as officers remained nearby. Samuel would attend. Patricia would wear a recording device. Claire also agreed to come, though I did not tell her everything. At 6 o'clock Sunday evening, my mother arrived wearing a navy dress and my grandmother's pearls. She carried flowers. "For Emily," she said. Emily did not take them. Curtis arrived 5 minutes later, even though I had not invited him. That was exactly what the detective expected. My mother introduced him as a family financial advisor. We sat in the dining room. No food was served. Instead, 6 blue folders waited on the table. My mother's smile weakened. "What is this?" I opened the first folder, a copy of the real deed to my house. I opened the second, a copy of the forged deed. Curtis stood. "This sounds like a private family matter. Sit down." My mother snapped. He obeyed. I turned to Patricia. "Did I sign that deed in front of you?" Patricia covered her mouth. My mother stared at her. "Be careful." Patricia lowered her hand. "No. Daniel did not sign it. Victoria brought it to me." The Claire whispered, "Mom, what did you do?" My mother did not answer her. She looked only at me. "Your father intended everything to remain in the family. Emily and Lily are my family. Emily is temporary. The room became still. Emily sat beside me with one hand resting over her stomach. My mother pointed at her. That woman has poisoned you against me. She wants the company. She wants this house. She wants you isolated. I pressed a button on my phone. The hallway recording played through the dining room speakers. Curtis's voice filled the room. Once the equity line clears, we move the money before Daniel gets back. Then my mother's answer came. Emily will be gone by then. She is too weak to fight. My mother's face lost all color. Curtis moved toward the door. 2 detectives entered before he reached it. They identified themselves and told everyone to remain seated. My mother looked at me as if I had committed the crime. You called the police on your own mother. No, I said. I called the police on the woman who forged my name, threatened my wife, and tried to steal our home. She rose slowly. Everything I did was for my children. Claire began to cry. You used our names to hide your debt. My mother ignored her. She stepped toward Emily. Tell him the truth. Tell him you enjoyed turning him against me. I stood between them. You will never order my wife to kneel again. My mother gave me the same look she had used when I was a child. The look that promised punishment after everyone else went home. But I was not a child anymore. And this time, she was the one leaving. The detectives arrested Curtis that evening on fraud-related charges connected to the loan application. My mother was not taken away immediately because investigators were still assembling the full case. She mistook that delay for victory. The next morning, she called members of our extended family and claimed Emily had invented everything. By noon, 3 relatives had contacted me to say I was cruel for humiliating a grieving widow. At 2 o'clock, my mother posted online that she was the victim of financial abuse by her children. At 4 o'clock, Samuel filed an emergency civil action freezing her authority over the trust. At 5, the company board suspended her access to all corporate accounts. At 6, the bank formally rejected the fraudulent loan. At 7, Claire sent the family a copy of Patricia's sworn statement. By 8, my mother had deleted her post. That should have been the end. It was not. 2 days later, Emily received a message from an unknown number. Daniel will blame you when his mother loses everything. Leave before the baby comes. The number belonged to a prepaid phone, but investigators traced its activation to a store near my mother's home. Then someone left a dead bouquet on our porch. Attached was a card that read, "Mercer women do not beg." Emily finally broke. She locked herself in the nursery and cried beside Lily's empty crib. I sat on the floor outside the door. Emily, I know an apology cannot repair what I allowed. The door opened. She looked exhausted. I don't need you to fight your mother because you are angry, she said. I need you to protect this family even after your anger is gone. That sentence changed me. Revenge is easy when rage is fresh. Justice requires discipline after the fire cools. I obtained a permanent protective order. We added cameras, informed the hospital, and changed our birth plan so no visitor could enter without Emily's written approval. I also began therapy. For the first time, I spoke honestly about my childhood. I described how my mother controlled money, affection, and silence. I admitted that Dad often protected us indirectly but rarely challenged her in public. Then Samuel found one final envelope, in my father's private files. It was addressed to me. Inside was a handwritten letter and an unsigned amendment to the family trust. Dad had written, "Daniel, if you are reading this, then I waited too long to do what was right. Your mother believes ownership is the same as love. It is not. Protect Claire. Protect the family you choose. Never make your wife earn the safety that should come with your name." I read the final sentence 3 times. Dad had seen the danger. He had prepared a new trust amendment that would remove my mother as acting trustee if she attempted an unauthorized transfer or used trust property to secure personal debt. Legally, the paper had no power, but it gave us a map. Claire and I petitioned the court to remove Victoria, based on fraud, self-dealing, and breach of fiduciary duty. We did not rely on Dad's unsigned amendment. We relied on bank records, the forged deed, the loan application, Patricia's testimony, and the hallway recording. 6 weeks later, our daughter was born. Emily labored for 14 hours. When the nurse placed Lily in my arms, she opened her eyes for one quiet second. I thought about the house, the company, and the inheritance my mother had treated like a crown. None of it felt as valuable as the small life breathing against my chest. Victoria tried to enter the maternity floor. Hospital security stopped her. She demanded to see her granddaughter. Emily heard the argument from her room. She looked at me. The old version of me might have asked her to compromise. The new version did not. I told security to escort Victoria from the property. She did not meet Lily. 3 months later, my mother pleaded guilty to multiple charges after prosecutors presented the forged deed, false loan documents, witness testimony, and recorded conversations. Patricia received a reduced sentence for cooperating. Curtis faced separate charges related to several other victims. The civil court removed my mother from the trust. Claire and I became co-trustees. We sold the large family estate, not because we needed the money, but because neither of us wanted to preserve a monument to fear. My mother's lawful share of income was used first to pay restitution, taxes, and legal obligations. The rest remained subject to the court's orders. She moved into a small condominium. For years, she had told Emily that a house determined a woman's worth. In the end, my mother still had walls, furniture, and a roof. What she no longer had was an audience. On Lily's first birthday, we held a party in our backyard. Emily's parents came from Ohio. Claire brought her children. Samuel arrived with a wooden box containing my father's old watch. After everyone left, Emily and I stood in the living room. The marble floor had been polished, but if the evening light hit it at the right angle, I could still see a faint mark where the silver basin had rested. I once wanted to replace the entire floor. Emily asked me not to. Why keep it? I said she took Lily from my arms and smiled, because that is where the truth finally became impossible to ignore. I looked at my wife, the woman my mother had tried to make feel homeless inside her own home. Then I looked at our daughter. The deed was now protected by a new family trust. Emily and Lily were named clearly. No secret amendment, false signature, or controlling relative could erase them. But the greatest change was not written on paper. It was written in the boundary I should have drawn years earlier. My mother believed family meant obedience. My father believed silence could keep the peace. I had believed love required endless forgiveness. We were all wrong. Love without safety is not love. Peace without truth is only fear wearing clean clothes. And forgiveness without consequences is an invitation to be hurt again. The day I found Emily kneeling on that marble floor, my mother told her, "This house belongs to my children, not you." 1 year later, I stood in the same room, held my wife's hand, and answered the words I should have answered long before. A house belongs to the people who make it safe. My mother lost the property she tried to steal, the power she tried to protect, and the family she tried to control. Emily never knelt for her again, and neither did I.